Evening, folks. Video 2 for Unit 6, talking about the progressive movement. This will be a rather quick video, comparatively speaking, and then there'll be a longer one about Presidents Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. That'll be the third one. In the opening video, we talked about the Hulk hands. There they are, still sitting here. I've got the same shirt on. It's the same night. Please don't think I wore the same shirt more than one day in a row. You know, I'm not in college or something like that. Also, I wanted to remind you that we'll have a test next week. So hopefully you are ready to roll on that. But for right now, we're on page 3 of the study guide. We are at the top of that study guide, and we are talking about the progressives. The progressives, if we follow the information along here, are a new movement in American society. Now, we talked about the populace. We have to make sure that we identify the populace and the progressives as being very different. The populace are rural. They're farmers. The progressives, on the other hand, are mostly concerned with the plight of urban immigrants and the situations where they're working and living. So let's talk about some basic information here. The progressives really thought that if you studied, and if you tracked, and if you logged enough information, that you could solve the problems of America's cities. They are optimistic about the fact that we can improve working conditions, living conditions, life expectancies, the rights of individuals. There is this movement about the progressives that's kind of electric, that they believe that there's nothing that can stop them as far as the urban reform that's going on in the early 20th century. Now, if you say progressive today in 2014, it takes on a whole nother connotation. Let's just keep it in the 1900 or so meaning here. This is a group of individuals who did not buy the social Darwinist argument. They didn't believe that you were responsible for everything in your life. Perhaps you were born into a bad situation. Maybe the environment was poor, and therefore something about that environment could be adjusted by the society itself. They believed in what we call legal realism. Legal realism is the idea that laws should keep in mind the actual day-to-day existence of people. That theoretical is fine and well and good, but that when we make laws, that we should assure that those laws follow along with what the daily life of people are going to be like. Most of these people follow that waspy world that I talked about in the last video. White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, strong urge to reform, strong urge to try and change different aspects of society. Now keep in mind, most of the people that they're going to try and help aren't of the same religious background. Most of the people living in those cities, whether they're Irish or Italian or Slavic or Jews, are either Catholics or they're Jewish, or Eastern Orthodox for that matter. They're not generally Protestants. So that's going to be kind of a conflict there, here and there. But, moving along. What's a muckraker? A muckraker is generally a journalist, someone who exposes the underside of an issue that we don't want to talk about. Someone who perhaps brings up a topic that is taboo or that we didn't know was seedy, and they show us that seedy world that's out there. In what ways was each of the following a muckraker? Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis is a photographer and a good friend to Teddy Roosevelt's. And Riis goes out and he takes pictures of the squalor and the living conditions in New York City and writes a book called How the Other Half Lives. And How the Other Half Lives chronicles in photojournalism all of the plight and the living conditions of immigrants in America. In a way, reveals to people in a very in-your-face fashion, this is what it looks like. In case you thought that it was glamorous, or that it was roomy, or that it was comfortable, or that it was clean, this is the reality of it. Ida Tarbell spends a great deal of time muckraking or writing about the practices of Standard Oil, and how John Rockefeller, as a businessman, took out smaller businesses and really used his power to destroy a lot of smaller businesses in America. The progressive period really spawns a lot of women who are active in the movement. Now keep in mind, a progressive is generally urban, generally educated. So these are women who would have come from middle class or better backgrounds. They would have been college educated. They would have had a strong religious zeal about them. And it's important to remember that they generally acted very locally, like Jane Addams. Jane Addams founds what's called Hull House. It's a settlement house, or what we would call a shelter, for immigrant women who needed somewhere to stay for job training or someone to watch the kids while they got their feet underneath them as far as working in a job. And so Addams' movement, eventually Addams goes on to much bigger things as far as the world stage. She's a huge peace advocate. She wins the Nobel Prize too. But for our purposes, we're concerned about Hull House in Chicago, which is sometimes called the settlement house or a halfway house for women. Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt are both involved in the suffrage movement. trying to get votes for women and trying to assure that women have a right to vote. Now, both of them believe that women should get the right to vote, not because they can act as role models or that perhaps we have this obligation to let women lead the children. No, they have a right to vote because, frankly, they're human beings and they deserve that right to vote. It shouldn't be something that women have to work harder to earn. Margaret Sanger opens a birth control clinic in New York City. That's a pretty taboo topic. Sanger had noticed that immigrant women and immigrant families had a huge problem with trying to make enough money to get by, and what she proposed was if they knew more about birth control, they could essentially practice what a lot of middle-class people had been practicing for a generation at least, and that was family planning. By scoping down the size of the family, the resources of the family are not stretched as much, and therefore there's a little more prosperity for each child. Progressives Part 2 down at the bottom of the page here, I beg your pardon. Robert La Follette. La Follette's remembered for being this leader of the progressive movement in the state of Wisconsin. In the Wisconsin State House and throughout the legislature, La Follette passed movements that allowed the people greater access to government. They passed a initiative, they also passed the referendum, and they passed the direct primary, the recall as well. All of these allowed people to participate in the governing process more closely. Therefore, La Follette's a big deal. We talked a lot in class about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, tragic fire in New York City in 1911. When all of those immigrant women died. What should you remember about this? You should remember that it's a sign of what the working conditions were like, that it was crowded, that it was cramped, that there wasn't a lot of regulation of the workplace, and therefore a lot of safety conditions that should have been seen were not seen. Progressive legislation passed afterwards. They're going to do a lot for fire safety, a lot more inspections, taller ladders, trying to make sure that there's fire escapes on buildings, hopefully so that you don't have that much carnage if there's ever an incident again. The goal of the Niagara movement and the NAACP, the Niagara movement's goal is to try and get equal rights for African Americans immediately, and the Niagara movement founded in 1909 the NAACP. One of the charter members of that group, previously spoken about in the first video, W.E.B. Du Bois, who writes for The Crisis, which is the journal of the NAACP. And that leads us right up to Teddy Roosevelt. And we'll start off in our next video talking about Roosevelt, Taft, and then President Wilson. So that'll be a longer video, but this is video 2 of 3. I hope you watch all 3 of them. I hope they're helpful, and I hope you're doing well, ladies and gentlemen. Take care.